Hi everyone, I am here today with a very quick review of another offbeat read that probably very few people have ever read before, especially people still alive today, and that is a public domain book called The Mob Violence in the American Negro, My Experience in the Sunny South by Velley Lester. I randomly picked this one off because it was a new recording on Librivox and sounded intriguing. It's the account of a black Louisiana preacher or lecturer named Velley Lester who recounts a near escape from lynching when he was preaching in Mississippi about temperance, or abstinence from alcohol and drugs, during the early Jim Crow years. Quick warning, this video talks about racism and lynching, though not in any explicit or graphic detail. This should probably be obvious from the title, but just wanted to say it again just in case. Unfortunately, because this work is super esoteric, it was hard to find much of the broader context surrounding it, aside from what I already know of the post-Reconstruction era and the early Jim Crow South. The book itself is not the most interesting, and it's one that I'd not recommend for anyone but the most diehard historians. There's some interesting content in it, but probably it would have been more useful to me in the form of a 30 to 60 minute essay rather than a 2+ hour book. Although the book purports to be about, well, mob violence in the American South, that's only part of it. A lot of the chapters are not about the violence at all, but are simply full reprints of the author's sermons on temperance, going into lengthy detail about the vices of alcohol and how it ruins families. Though these writings might be of interest in themselves for some historians, I wasn't expecting this from the title and description of the book, and as such I actually wondered about 15 to 30 minutes into the first section, which is a fairly lengthy sermon, whether maybe a chapter of the wrong book had been recorded by mistake. This wasn't actually the case, but it highlights that a lot of this book isn't really about the mob violence in the American South. These sections weren't quite that interesting to me either because since I lacked a broader awareness of the temperance movements in the South at the time, I didn't really have any idea how these sermons were perceived by the public, although admittedly it's possible this is actually critical to understanding why the lynch mob was after him, so let me know in the comments if you have any ideas about this that I missed. The author's account of his own escape from lynching by a white mob is valuable and an important historical account. I wasn't entirely able to understand whether it was something about his sermons in particular that threatened them, or whether there was no real reason at all other than racism for their wanting to kill him. It seems, though, that he kind of managed to smooth talk his way out of being lynched, appealing to a sort of higher morality and God's judgment after death, and thus he lived to tell the tale to the rest of us. Following that incident, he naturally became more vocally opposed against the rule of mob violence over the rule of law, though the writing covers this in less detail than I personally hoped for. One thing I found interesting is that he was still far from preaching fundamental equality of black and white Americans, or even of separate but equal treatment for that matter, basically upholding the idea that blacks and whites are kind of fundamentally different in a manner that was consistent with some of the prevailing racist notions of the time held by both blacks and whites. As he tells it, he was merely against the reign of mob rule. He'd rather see real criminals sentenced in court than see a mob haphazardly kill any black Americans simply because they had a vendetta against one or two in particular, which, as the author expressed it, could have been a very legitimate grievance, just one against a particular person rather than an entire racial group. While reading this, it was of course hard to tell whether this perfectly reflected the author's own views or whether he was instead presenting a diplomatic and even political argument that would be more palatable to his white audiences who still adhered to many of the common racist views of the time. I really can't speculate any more about which is the case, though, other than that I think both possibilities are totally plausible. Obviously, since I'm no scholar in this area, this is just my take on the book, and I'm sure there's a lot that I missed or even slightly misinterpreted. Let me know if you caught anything I missed or if you read this and interpreted something differently. Yeah, okay, I admit that's pretty unlikely given that this book didn't even exist on Goodreads when I looked it up, but if you've made it to this review and watched so far, who knows? Until next time, bye, and happy reading.